We begin this unit with talking about the chemistry of carbon. Carbon, if you recall, is the basis of all organic molecules. Organic means things that are living or once was living. And all things that are organic contain carbon. And if you recall from our units and our lessons of atoms, carbons have 4 valence electrons which allow them to bond to each other, making long chains of carbon. Again, all things that are living or once were living are made up of carbon and have carbon and other molecules within them. As we start to get into some of our terminology and vocabulary, some of the terms you need to know are monomers versus polymers. A monomer, which is right here, is a single molecule. I want you to try to remember a monomer like an individual puzzle piece. A monomer by itself is just an individual puzzle piece and doesn't really have much meaning by itself. But when many puzzle pieces are put together to make these giant puzzles or giant pictures, they form together to make something. That's like a polymer. A polymer is when you take many individual monomers like this blue one, this purple one, this green one, and you put them together like a puzzle, they make what's called a polymer, which is one giant molecule. So in summary, a monomer is a single individual small molecule, while a polymer is a long giant molecule. You can try to remember it by mono. If you remember, the prefix mono means one, and the prefix poly means many. So mono means one molecule, and poly means many molecules. Just as we said in the last slide, here is your basic definition. A monomer is a smaller unit of molecules, where a polymer is put together by many monomers and it makes a larger molecule. So what are macromolecules? As you can read here, macromolecules are a very large molecule that make up most of the structures of the body. So if you split the word in half, the word macro right here is the opposite of micro, which means tiny, so it means large. And a molecule is a group of elements put together. So a macromolecule is a group of large molecules that make up just about every living thing. As we said before, they're made up of small pieces called monomers, and I apologize, I don't know why this is out of place, but all large chains of monomers, which would belong here, is called a polymer. There are 4 major organic compounds or macromolecules. You've probably heard of these. First one is a carbohydrate, second one is a lipid, third one is a nucleic acid, and last and not least is proteins. We're now going to look at each of the individual macromolecules. First one we're going to look at is a carbohydrate. When you break down a carbohydrate in your digestive system, your body's going to break them down to the monomer of a carbohydrate is known as a monosaccharide. If you split the word monosaccharide in half, the prefix mono means one, saccharide means sugars. So the monomer of a carbohydrate is one single sugar. An example would be glucose. Now a polymer is when you take many of these monosaccharides and you put them together, and therefore you make a polysaccharide. Now the prefix again for poly means many, saccharide is sugar, so it means many sugars. A group of many sugars put together, an example of it would be a starch. Starches are things like potatoes and rice. Now when you look at a macromolecule, especially the carbohydrate, it's very common that it is in a ring shape and is always going to be made up of carbon. Now all carbohydrates are made up of carbon and water, because if you take the word carbo is carbon, and hydrate, to say if you need to be hydrated, deals with water. So the molecule of carbohydrate is a piece of carbon mixed with water. And its main function in our bodies, the reason we need to eat carbohydrates, is to gain energy. That's why carbohydrates are extremely abundant in breakfast foods, and that's where you get the majority of your energy. You can also find some of this in plant structures such as corn, celery, and a lot of other common everyday plants. And again, as you can see here, you can recognize all carbohydrates because you'll have one carbon mixed with water, and it's always going to be The basic formula is when you're going to have 1 part carbon, that's why if you have C6, you can have double the amount of hydrogen, so double of 6 is 12, and then again 1 part oxygen. It's always going to be a 1-to-1 ratio. And this slide just reiterates what I just said in the last slide, that carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Hydrogen and oxygen is water, and it's always going to be a 1-to-1 ratio. And then all living things use carbohydrates as their main source of energy. Here are some examples of some different types of carbohydrates. This is a common everyday picture of glucose, which is the most common sugar that we eat. Now, this picture here is what's called a disaccharide. Again, di means 2, and that's why you have 1 sugar, 2 sugars. So this is a disaccharide. This is a combination of glucose and fructose, which makes sucrose, which is like ordinary table sugar. And this giant picture here is a polysaccharide, more common starch, like a potato. This slide here is just another example of some pictures of what carbohydrates can look like. If you were to count these up, you would eventually get a 1-to-1 ratio. And what I mean by that, if you count up, you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hydrogens, which means you should have 5 carbon, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5 oxygen, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. See? 1 part carbon, twice as many hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. Just like same thing here with your glyceride. 3 part carbon, 6 part hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. Always a 1-to-1 ratio. Here are just some normal everyday examples of carbohydrates. Ordinary sugar, potatoes. Cellulose is the type of structure that makes up plant cell walls. And same thing, glycogen is also in the human body. Here's another example of starch found in an ordinary plant cell. As we move on to our second macromolecule, we're going to go into lipids. Lipids is another word for fat. Now, all lipids break down to their monomer, which will be broken down into 3 fatty acids, which will be held together by glycerol. Glycerol is a type of alcohol molecule. When you put these 3 fatty acids and glycerols together in a long chain, they make up fats and lipids. Fats and lipids will always be made up of, again, 3 long chains of carbon held together by a glycerol molecule. Some of the most important uses of fat in our body is to store long-term energy. We use it as protection, actually, in our midsections. It keeps a lot of organisms warm, and it also keeps things waterproof. Some basic examples of fats are basic fat, oil, like cooking oil, and cholesterol. Again, some of your basic uses for fats is to store energy. So, for example, if you are a type of person who eats a large amount of sugar or fat and does not burn it off from doing exercise, that's when people will gain weight, because that energy that is found in the food which you would eat is not being burned, then collects in the body as stored energy, which is known as fat or gaining weight. Parts of your fat also will help you become waterproof because you have oils in your skin, and as we should know that oil and water do not mix. That's the reason why if you go in the pool or take a bath, your body does not absorb all of the water in the bathtub and you don't blow up like a sponge. Here are a few other basic functions of fat. It is to protect your vital organs. Right down in here in your midsection, known as your belly, if you could feel around your belly, there is no bones there, but there are some very important organs behind that. So the fat will be able to protect some of the actual organs. Fat is also an excellent insulator. For larger organisms like these seals here live in extremely cold water, and that's why they're coated with very thick amounts of blubber, known as fat, which helps them stay warm in the cold water. Here are some basic examples of what a lipid looks like at its molecular structure. Again, you have 1, 2, 3 fatty acids held together by 1 glycerol. Again, here are some common categories or examples of fats, known as basic normal fat that you would see in, like, say, from a piece of steak. Oils, like cooking oil, like vegetable oil or olive oil. Wax, like candle wax, is also a fat. And steroids, even the same kind of medication that some people will take, is also made from a fat. Here are just some basic pictures of lipids. Again, margarine or butter is basically fat, oil is fat, and wax is a fat. As we move on to the next macromolecule, which are proteins, all proteins will break down as their monomer is what's called an amino acid. There are 20 different types of amino acids in the human body. At any different sequence of these amino acids will put together and form their polymer, known as either as a common word of a protein or also known as what's called a polypeptide. The basic structure of a single amino acid is made up of 3 different things: amino groups, carboxyl groups, or also known as an R group or an R chain. Your basic function or uses of protein is to help build muscle and bones, and also can be used as sources of energy after carbohydrates are burnt up. Some of the most easiest and most common ways to eat protein will be in meat, fish. It can also be found in some dairy, eggs, and a few other products. Here are some other basic functions of proteins. Some proteins control the rate of reactions for cellular processes. Protein is probably the most abundant type of macromolecule in the human body, and it does a lot of different things. Proteins are things like enzymes, hormones. Hormones, for example, like testosterone controls male growth and male sex drive, where estrogen can control a woman's birth cycle. Those are different hormones, which are examples of proteins. Another example of a protein as a hormone would be adrenaline, which gets people fired up or excited. Proteins also can be used, which are part of like white blood cells, help fight diseases as well. So there are many functions for proteins in our body, and there are many different kinds. This is a molecular picture of a protein. You have your amino group is right here, your carboxyl group is right here, and this little R here is an R chain. And again, all macromolecules are always held together by a carbon. Here is just another example of some proteins. And again, if you take one amino acid and 2 amino acids, when they are joined together by what's called a peptide bond, you then create a dipeptide, or a larger 2 groups of peptides, which then create a protein. Here are just some simple examples of where you can get protein from: milk, fish, meat, shellfish. Proteins are like chickens and poultry. Cheese, beans, and nuts are also very high in protein. Last but not least, the last of the macromolecules are what's called a nucleic acid. When nucleic acids are broken down to their monomer form, is what's called a nucleotide. There are 5 examples of nucleotides in the human body. The structure or the individual, how you break down a nucleotide, is broken down to a 5-carbon sugar, which is attached by a nitrogenous base, and a phosphate group. Their basic use of a nucleotide is to store your genetic code, provides all of the physical features and personality traits passed down by your parents. And examples of nucleotides are DNA, RNA, ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. Again, an individual nucleotide is made up of 3 parts and is a 5-carbon sugar, phosphate group, nitrogenous base. And we will be building these over time throughout the class. Here are some pictures of a nucleic acid. Again, this is one monomer of a nucleotide, and here is your phosphate group, your 5-carbon sugar, and your nitrogenous base. This whole thing right here is a big picture of DNA that's unwound. And again, this darker blue color is your carbon. This lighter blue is the phosphorus. And all these 4 different colors are the different examples of the nitrogenous bases. As you read here, nucleic acids, again, are meant to store all of your genetic codes, which is also known as transmitting heredity. Basically means the same thing, which is giving you your physical features. There are 2 examples of nucleic acids in our body, which are RNA, known as ribonucleic acid, and DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. Both things help us give our physical features. Here are some examples as to where you find DNA in the human body. This hopefully you recognize as a chromosome. A chromosome is nothing more than a very tightly wound up long piece of DNA. This is a picture of a bacteria cell, and again, there is tons of DNA free floating inside of it. All living organisms contain DNA.